I want you to open your Bibles tonight to the book of Exodus as we begin a new series, Meeting God in the Wilderness. I have worked with a lot of broken people. I have studied under a lot of broken people, and I could never thank God enough that He allowed me to do that. Because broken people who have been healed can help you. They can help me. My first mentor was a man by the name of H. Leo Edelman. You ought to look him up. H. Leo Edelman. He was the protege of A.T. Robertson, who was probably the greatest Greek scholar of the last 200 years. H. Leo Edelman did his PhD in Greek, Koine Greek, under A.T. Robertson in the late 20s and was scheduled as his protege to take over when God called Leo Edelman to Nazareth, Israel, where he learned Arabic and then he taught himself Hebrew, so he was fluent in the biblical languages, fluent in them. After 2 weeks in his class, he came to me and he said, "Mr. Crisp, I cannot teach you Hebrew." My heart sank. That was the first class. That was the only class that was available when I got to school. Why can you not teach me Hebrew? He said, "You don't know English." He said, "Were you not taught English?" I said, "They tried." And they did. And I knew something, but I didn't know anything about how sentences were put together. I didn't know where verbs and the analytical language of English, which it is an analytical language. And so he handed me a little brown handbook, and he said, "You've got 4 months." He said, "If you'll teach yourself English over the next 4 months, I'll teach you Hebrew." And God, in His great mercy, let me spend a lot of time with Leo Edelman, because I studied English 3 hours a night till I taught myself English. And then I learned Hebrew because I was eat up with language by that time. At the end of the first semester, he said, "If you will stick with me 1 more semester, I want you to be my teaching assistant next year. And I want you to become the tutor of Hebrew for the college." And God let me have a desire to learn the languages of the Bible. As I have studied the Hebrew language and as I have gone through the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, called the Pentateuch by all of us, the 5 scrolls of Moses, and then throughout the history of Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, as I learned the framework of how God worked in the great story of redemption, I have been astounded over the years that men like Dr. Edelman, who had applied themselves, who were gifted, went through great suffering and sorrow in their life. I've not ever known a great man of God who has not known great suffering and brokenness. And it's not just in our generation and in the past generations in America and in the states that we know very well. But you study the life of the great men of God in the Bible and the great men since. Charles Haddon Spurgeon. There's hardly anybody in America that are in churches that haven't heard the name of C.H. Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon had such great fits of depression that he would lie in his study for days with his wife worried about him, with the door locked, and he would be crying out before God, "Either fill me or kill me," because he was so desperate for God. I've listened to Dr. Stanley with my own ears as we have had meals together. Tell me about the days of depression. I've talked with his staff members who talked of his Great Depression. And I could go on and on and on with people you would recognize if I call their names, but what I'm trying to get across to you is, In the Christian life, those that God uses, He usually has to break them before He can use them to their fullest extent. Dr. Stanley told me, he said, Tony, you'll always be either going into a wilderness, a time of testing and brokenness and trial, or you will be in a trial, or you'll be coming out on the other side of a trial, because this life is filled with trials. And anybody that's lived very long knows that, and you say, well, I don't know anything about that. You will. Because you're going to know brokenness if you're going to be used by God. You're going to know brokenness in this life even if you're not used by God, because this life is filled with heartache and misery. This world is filled with sin. It's cursed by sin. Leo Edelman said to me, God is going to use you in the days ahead. His good hand is upon you. But I'm here to tell you that the brokenness you've experienced in your young life will be multiplied many times before you meet the Lord. So he said, my advice to you is to just lie down in the road of life and let life run over you, because in doing that, God will squeeze out of you all that is bad, and He'll only keep the good. God is still working on every one of us. No one has arrived. And so, as we look at the book of Exodus, I want you to turn to chapter 16. Because you see, this is when Moses and the children of Israel have just come out of Egyptian bondage. Moses and Miriam have sung their songs and they've been recorded. The Red Sea and the great miracle of God that opened up the water where they went on dry ground and then drowned the entire Egyptian army, that's behind. The great night of Passover is over. The great miracles of God that showed that indeed He was God, those are now past, and the first thing they do is face the wilderness. That's where we pick up on the narrative in chapter 16, and at the close of chapter 15, they have come into the desert territory, and you just have to know the geography. They went into a wilderness, and a wilderness is not a wilderness like we are here in this county. This is the beginning of the Wilderness Trail. That means mountains and verdant green trees and forest. And we call this the wilderness. And it is a wilderness, but the wilderness in the Middle East is desert, barrenness, dryness. And God led them. God led them to a source of water. Listen to this. According to verse 22 through 27 of chapter 15, God led them to a source of water that was bitter. It was so bitter they couldn't even drink it. And why did He do that? So that He could begin to show that no matter what they faced, He could fix it. He could get them through it. And so He told Moses, you take this stick and you throw it in that water and I'll make it sweet. And so Moses obeyed. Did that make sense? Does that make sense to you? You throw a stick in the water and it turns sweet? Our first lesson in discerning how to survive in the wilderness, hardly anything makes sense. If you're going to wait to get through the wilderness until you can figure it out, you'll die in the wilderness. Because much of what God does in our lives doesn't make sense to the human, sinful, sin-cursed mind. And when you know somebody that continues saying, well, that doesn't make sense to me, then they're going to have some problems discerning the will of God. Because God's will doesn't always make sense to the human mind. If we blow past this for the next 42 years, and Joshua crosses over into the promised land of what is modern-day Israel, and they face Jericho, And God has assembled this great army. They are trained warriors. They've been numbered, thousands upon thousands of them. And they go in, and instead of blowing the shofar and overtaking a city, God says, here's how we're going to conquer the city. You're going to go out, keep your mouths closed, and you're going to march around the city and come back to camp. This went on for 7 days. Because you see, God was not worried about their ability. He wanted to show them His ability. This is how you survive in the wilderness. Not with your ingenuity and all of your training. Oh, that might come in handy. God may use that. But you see, it's only God that can get us through the broken times in the wilderness. And He was showing them right up front, this is going to be a miraculous walk. And so the bitter water turning sweet was just the first. Because you see, they hadn't even been out a month, and they were already complaining. We don't have enough water. And so God brought them to Marah. That's what it's called, because the word Marah means bitter. Chapter 16, and they journeyed from Elim, because God had led them, since they had faithfully followed Him through the waters of Marah, bitterness. God led them to a place with 70 palm trees, which meant there was sweet water there. And you can read about that in verse 27 of chapter 15. And after they camped by the waters there, they journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. And on the 15th day of the second month after they departed from the land of Egypt, then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, and when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. How's that for gratitude? God had just miraculously delivered them from 400 years in Egypt. He had delivered them from slavery and the evil taskmasters. They had seen the hand of God, and the first time something didn't go right, they are ready to go back to the flesh pots of Egypt. And so you know the story. God rained down bread from heaven. And they didn't know what it was. And they named it a question. Manna. What is it? For 40 years, they ate what the Bible called angels' food, and for 40 years, they asked the question, what is it? Every morning, they went out and went, manna. What is it? And they complained about the taste of it. They complained about they couldn't save it up. It was a miraculous bread from heaven. And if you watch what I call the evolution channels, TLC, Discovery, all of those, that are always trying to explain away in a natural way the miracles, they will tell you that this was a certain kind of thing that was just a natural occurrence. Well, it naturally occurred with the same amount, just the right amount, for 5 days, and then on the 6th day, it doubled. Every week for 40 years. And then on the 7th day, nothing came for 40 years. And then the same thing was repeated. They don't deal with that in the evolutionary channels, because you see, they haven't read the book. God is a God of miracles. And let me just say this at the outset. If you believe what the biblical account of creation, everything else ought to be a cinch for you. Because if God could speak out of nothing everything that there is, if He could say, let there be, and there was, and there is, and there shall be, if He could do all of that, actually the resurrection is not the greatest miracle. It's that God brought it all into existence. He brought life into existence. He can take it away just as quickly as He brought it in His Word, by the breath of His nostrils. You can start following the journey, And as you did in reading through Exodus, you come to chapter 17, and God brought water from a rock. It would have been like a river. Now, this is not just a little stream, again, like we have been taught to believe. This was a river enough for millions of people to drink from. And it followed them. Finally, in chapter 20, they came. In chapter 19 to Mount Sinai. In chapter 20, Moses went up on the mountain for 40 days. He was there and he met God face to face. From Exodus chapter 25 to the end of the chapter, to the end of the book, you have the schematic and the blueprint for the great worship center that they will build the entire camp around and build their lives around in the wilderness for 40 years. Now, please understand that everything I have just described to you, all the way from Exodus chapter 12, when the Passover took place, all the way to what we would call the book of Numbers, all of that desert and all of that wilderness was what I call a legitimate, God-chosen wilderness. You see, there's two types of wilderness experiences in the Torah. The first one is what I call a legitimate wilderness. It's a God-led wilderness experience. You see, it was God that led them through the wilderness. Why? Because He wanted to take them to Mount Sinai where they could meet Him personally. And after they left Mount Sinai, they went to the journey on the way to Canaan. And they came to Kadesh Barnea. You can read about that as you go through the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers is called the book of Numbers because of two census that were taken. The first one in the first 5 chapters of Numbers. That's why I had you turn there. And then the second one was at the end of the wilderness wanderings to make sure all of those who chose the desert that was illegitimate, not of God's choosing, it was one they chose. Because you see, there's a wilderness for everyone. God is going to lead you into a wilderness that He chooses for you because He wants to remind you that He is a God of purpose and He's taking you somewhere. And in order to get to Canaan, we have to go through a wilderness. And God led them through a wilderness. No other way to get there from Egypt. And so He led them that way. That was the best way for them. But when you get into the book of Numbers and you get past the census and you start reading, you come to chapter 11 and the people are complaining again. And when you get to 13 and 14, spies are sent out from Kadesh Barnea. This is the story of the spies and the two famous spies, Joshua and Caleb. They were the faithful ones. Those were the ones that saw the same thing that everybody else did, but they did not look at the size of the obstacle of the giants. They looked at the size of their God in comparison to the giants, not the other way around. Big difference. And so from chapter 14 onward, the wilderness that they experienced, God was still with them. He still provided for them. He still gave them water. He still gave them manna. He gave them all that they needed in spite of their disobedience. But the desert of their own choosing was barren. The desert of their own choosing was barren. It was unfruitful. And they all died in the wilderness. They did not experience what God had for them. In other words, when God leads you through a desert, into a desert of His own choosing, there is the sense of the presence of God. When there is fruitfulness, there is purpose. But when we choose a desert through our disobedience, it's dry, it's barren, it's death, it's decay. It is one heartache after another. And even though God is with us and has not abandoned us, we miss His best. And the Bible is replete with men and women who missed God's best. People say all the time to me, oh, you've studied the life of David. You've written on the life of David. You've done your dissertation on the life of David. Isn't it wonderful that God forgave him? Isn't it wonderful that He still used him after his great sin of adultery and murder and cover-up and lying and cheating? Yes, it is great. But only David knows now what he missed. In Psalm 51, which is David's prayer of confession, he cried out and he said, God, have mercy on me. May your hesed give you the ability to forgive my stepping over the line. That's the word pashah, the word for transgression. Psalm 51, 1 and 2. God, I stepped over the line. I stepped out of bounds. I reached for something that wasn't mine. I took something that wasn't mine. And then I covered it up. I lied. I cheated. God, have mercy on me. And he threw himself on the mercy of God. And he said, forgive my iniquity, my twisting, my distorting, my blaming others, me being the victim. I tried to blame others. It's in our genes. It's in the sin nature that we inherited from our first parents to blame someone else for our own failures. That's magnified in the wilderness. And so the word avon is used for iniquity, twisting, guilt. He said, I have sinned. I've stepped over the line. I've crossed the boundaries. And then I've twisted that. And then he said the words that I'm getting to is this. He said, Lord, I have sinned. And the word is chata. C-H-A-T-T-A-H. Chata. And it is the word for missing the target. For coming up short. It's the same word that in the New Testament is hamartia. For all have sinned, all have missed the mark. What is the mark? The glory of God Himself. For all have sinned and come short, fallen short of the glory of God. You see, we can't compare ourselves with one another because God doesn't. He compares us, each one of us, to the purpose and will that He has for our life. Yes, the standard and plumb line for everyone, but every person in here, God puts you on this earth to glorify Him. To not do what you want to do. This is why you need to be careful when you go to guidance counselors in whatever school it is. And you say, I'm going to take an aptitude test and that's what I want to do in my life. Listen, that may show you what you're good at, but it's not going to be your goodness that's going to accomplish the will of God. You need to be asking God, what do you want me to do? And that's what we need to teach our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Find out what God wants you to do. I taught my children from the very beginning. The greatest adventure in life, the greatest adventure in life is to know God. To know God's will for your life and do it. So that one day you can stand before Him and hear, well done, good and faithful servant. He didn't say good and successful servant, good and wealthy servant, good with portfolio servant, good straight A and 4.0 servant. But well done, good and faithful servant. The wilderness and the desert of Israel's choosing caused them to miss God's plan for their life. What was His plan? To fulfill His promise to their ancestor Abraham and bring them that He brought out of Egypt into the promised land. They never made it. God didn't abandon them, they abandoned God. Do you know that Moses prayed to God to kill him? He said, God, kill me. I can't do anything with these people. They're accusing me of everything. Moses prayed and said, God, will you just take my life now? Because I can't go on with these people. Now, God, in His mercy, did not do that. But as you go through the scriptures, you're going to see the similarities between Moses and another man of God, Elijah. Both Elijah and Moses had just come from the greatest victories that anyone could ever imagine. And they had seen the great hand of God at the Red Sea, Moses had. The great move of God. And Moses yet prayed and said, God, kill me. I can't take it anymore. These people are ungrateful. They don't appreciate me. They don't appreciate you. And they have complained. So God, if you're going to make me take these people any farther, just go ahead and get over with. When was that? That was after the greatest victory the world had ever seen to that time, since the days of Noah and the ark. Do you realize that still today we measure miracles by the Red Sea? Do you realize that the children of Israel still to this day celebrate at Passover what God did to Moses and the children of Israel? Every year for the last 3,400 years, they've celebrated the great miracles of Passover and freedom from bondage and going into the promised land. But I want to tell you about another man that we're going to learn about. Moses learned in the wilderness. But turn to the book of 1 Kings with me. Elijah, he just comes as a meteor in the night out of Tishbe, which is in Gilead, which is in modern-day Jordan, probably just north of the river Jabbok, where Jacob had wrestled with God. And he came like lightning over the Jordan River, and he said, it's not going to rain because it's the will of God to get your attention. And remember what Moses said in the book of Deuteronomy? He said, you're going into a land where you're going to have to depend on God. It's not like Egypt with irrigation systems. He said, when you go there, you're going to have to call out on God and live in obedience to Him. And if you walk with Him, He'll give you plenty of rain. He'll give you rain at the right time, not too much, not too little, just enough, and you're going to have bumper crops. But if you start disobeying God and you start worshiping the gods of the Canaanites, then God will withhold rain and drought will come. Elijah saw the sins of Ahab, the most wicked of all the northern kings after the split of the southern and northern kingdom at the death of Solomon. Ahab had married a Sidonian princess by the name of Jezebel. It's not one we name our daughters after today. And she had brought into the land Baal worship and Ashtaroth. And the children of Israel in the north began to worship and to break the commandments that God said, have no other gods before you. You shall not make graven images. They did all of that. And so Elijah came as a man of God and said, it's not going to rain. What God said is true, and by my word, it's not going to rain until I say it's going to rain. Now here's the amazing thing. God said, Elijah, at your word, I'm going to do what you said. And it's not going to rain until you give the word. But you're going to have to get out of here because they're going to start looking for you. They're going to want to kill you. So you know what God did? He took him back across the Jordan to a place called Kerith. It was a brook. That means it was a stream. And it's an amazing thing because it's instructive for us. God sent Elijah to a place that he was miraculously fed by birds who live off of carrion. They should have been eating everything, but they were bringing him good stuff. But God called him to sit beside, listen to this, a drying stream that he knew would dry up before the drought was over. In dealing with pastors and leadership across America, Many times people will say to me, well, I would like to go to that church over there, but I'm telling you that's a drying up city. That is a place where it's not growing, and I want to be in a place of growth. I don't want to be a place that's drying up. I don't believe God would send me to a place that's drying up. Well, you better read the book again. God doesn't always send His people beside clear waters. Sometimes God will send a person to a place that He knows is going to dry up. Why? Because God is not interested in you being a success. God is interested in doing what God does because He has a purpose. Then He sent him to a poor widow who didn't even have enough food except for one more meal that she and her son were going to eat and then die. Why? So He could miraculously provide for him. You see, here again, if we can't figure it out, we don't believe it's God. Now, I know you can get crazy about this and get out of the will of God. But if you are called to sit by a drying brook, or you're called to go to a place of famine, you better make sure it's God calling you and not you, or you'll die there. So that takes discernment and knowing God and the ways of God and the will of God. So we have to walk with God. But boy, when you come to chapter 18, is that not one of the greatest chapters of all? Elijah confronting the people of Israel and the priest of Baal. Go to Mount Carmel, I'll meet you there. Mount Carmel is the highest peak in that region. It's a range of mountains. It's not just a mountain. It's a range of mountains. It's like the Blue Ridge. It's a range of mountains. It's just a few miles. It's the finger mountain of the Samaritan Mountains that goes out to the sea and literally goes down at the modern city of Haifa. But every mountain range has horns. That is the highest peak, and that's called the horn. It's called the Karen. And so He said, go to the horns. Why would He have said, go to Mount Carmel? Carmel is the vineyard of God. It's a beautiful place, overlooking the Jezreel Valley, the breadbasket of the Middle East. He said, go there. Now, they wouldn't have gone to a low place. Have you ever read in the Bible, in our English versions, where it says a high place? You see, when they worshiped their false gods, they would go to the highest places because that was closest to heaven. And many of the Israelites did the same thing with God. And so there had been an altar there on the horns of Carmel at the highest point. There are several reasons why we know that Mukraka, that's the Arabic word for the place of the burning, the place of the altar, we know where that is today. And one of the ways we know it is, there's about 5 ways we know it is, but one of the ways is it is the highest peak on Mount Carmel. And it's the only way down that's not a sheer bluff to the Kishon River. That's another one. But I take people there today to show them that, because that is where you read of the great confrontation. Now, I'm telling you, this was a monumental turning point in the life of ancient Israel. And after it's over with, you remember that the prophets of Baal and Ashtaroth were killed at the Kishon River. And then he came back up and said to Ahab, you better get to Jezreel, 17 miles to Jezreel, through a valley that was a swamp. The Jezreel Valley is a beautiful breadbasket, but in the wintertime it's a swamp until the modern day Israelis went over there and drained that swamp. And so here is what Elijah said, you better get to Jezreel or you won't get there because it's going to rain. And you can read about him looking out over the Mediterranean, which you can see on a clear day as clear as a crystal. And he saw a cloud the size of a man's hand. That's this. You could barely see it. And he said, Ahab, you better get to Jezreel. Jezebel will be expecting you. And the Bible says Elijah ran ahead of the chariot. You say, oh, that's good. He is sprinting. 17 miles? Now, I'm telling you, you're talking about somebody that's in shape. He was in shape. But when he got there, after that great victory, Just like Moses, that great victory, the Red Sea, and seeing the 10 plagues and coming and watching God turn bitter water to crystal clear sweet water. And then Elam with the 70 palm trees, and then the manna from heaven and the quail and everything, and now Mount Sinai. And Moses is now saying, God, I've seen it all, kill me. Elijah just saw the greatest miracle since those days. And he went to Jezreel, and Ahab said, he killed the prophets. He won. Jezebel said, you let me get my hands on him. I'll cut his head off. I'll feed it to the birds. And Elijah said, I'm out of here. Stood before all of those people and trusted God. And now he's running from one woman. And he runs to the desert. You can look. He runs to the desert, gets under a broom tree, and says, God, kill me. Take my life. Moses, take my life. Total depression. How did God get those men out of that? Well, do you know God is so wonderful that He doesn't do everything the same way every time? Aren't you glad because we're not all the same? Aren't you glad He deals with us as individuals? Aren't you glad He knows every hair on your head? He knows us. And so what did He do to get Moses out of it? I don't want to go back to that passage because I'm dealing with Elijah, but I want you to understand He dealt with them in two different ways. Moses said, God, kill me. Well, God knew the reason that Moses felt that way because every day he listened to all the problems of the people and he had no one to help him. And so God said, Moses, get up off your face. I'm going to give you a plan. And God gave him a plan to share leadership with 70 elders, and Moses was a new man after that. And it's almost like when you read that, you're thinking Moses is going, man, why didn't I think of that? What about Elijah? Well, as you read the text, you'll see he escapes in chapter 19 from Jezebel. And in verse 4, he says, God, oh, that I might die. It is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers. He was totally depressed. He said, I've failed. Had Elijah failed? Oh, he'd been the great man of God on Mount Carmel. Had he failed? No. But I want to tell you, the enemy of our souls and our very flesh cries out and said, you're worth nothing. You're a constant failure. How many times have you and I said, I never want to do that again, only to what? Do it again. Well, I might do this and I might be bad, but I'd never do that, only to. Someone came to me not long ago, since I have been here, and said, how do you do this? How can men down through your 50 years of ministry accuse you of everything under the sun, sue you, talk about you? Does that not bother you? I said, it kills me. But it doesn't kill me as much as it used to kill me. Because you see, in studying great men of God, I read again through the words of Spurgeon, who was accused of everything, went through great throes of depression. But I read what Spurgeon said to a man who asked him that same question. How can you stand the accusations? He said, oh, I've come to find out that anything, he said, first of all, I've come to know myself and how wicked I am. And he said, the way I look at it is, whatever they accuse me of, I've either done or thought worse. You say, oh, not you, Pastor. Oh, yes, me, Pastor. Because you see, when people come at me, I want to go back at them. But you can't always do that. And I wish I could tell you I'm pristine pure. I'm not. But I want to give you a clue. Neither are you. And so Spurgeon was right. And so Elijah said, look, I'm no better than anyone else. Isn't it amazing that God refocused Elijah to where Elijah got awakened? That God wasn't comparing him with other people. He was comparing him with His will for his life. And so where Moses needed a plan that God gave to him, that gave him a new purpose, Elijah didn't get a new plan. He got a pause. When you read the story, Elijah looked up and there was an angel with angel's food and said, here, eat this, now go to sleep. He woke up, eat some more. Got a lot for you to do. Now go to sleep. Eat some more. Now go to sleep. Now that's my kind of remedy. No, the reality is he was worn out. And when you get tired, you make bad decisions. Have you noticed that? When you're emotionally distraught, you are not in a position to make good decisions. And so God said, I've got a new purpose for you. So where Moses needed a plan, Elijah needed a pause. He needed to rest. Have you ever heard of burnout? Burnout is when you are burning the candle at both ends. And I've listened to preachers all my life. I bet some of you have heard this too. Oh, I don't care. I might burn out, but I'm not going to rust out. I'm going to burn for Jesus. No, you're going to burn out. Because, you see, nobody's superhuman. Without the grace of God, we'd all be down. God had Moses and met Moses in the wilderness. And that's where he met God. He sent Elijah to a desert so he could slow down long enough to meet God in his wilderness. And then he sent him to where Moses had come from, to Mount Sinai, and that's where he gave him a new plan. I want to meet God in the wildernesses of my life, and I want you to. And I want you to listen to these messages as we go through the book of Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. As we follow people through the wilderness, we're going to follow David through the wilderness. And we're going to follow Jesus into the wilderness. Because you see, it was in the wilderness where Jesus was tempted and tested. And the Bible says in the Gospel of Luke chapter 4 that when he came out of the wilderness, he came to his own hometown and he was filled with the Spirit of God and power. Where had he been? He had been wrestling with the devil in the wilderness. Every one of us are either in a wilderness right now, we're headed into a wilderness, or we are just coming out of a wilderness. We need to be careful when people are in the wilderness. And we need to help them to get guidance and plan and purpose and encouragement, the food and the rest they need, the aid that they need. Because it's not going to be long till we'll be in the wilderness with them.